Good morning. I'm Richard Betts from the University of Exeter and the Met Office Hadley Centre, joining you live from here in Glasgow at COP26, where negotiations are underway to deal with the huge issue of climate change, both in terms of reducing global emissions of greenhouse gases, ultimately to net zero, to halt warming, and also to put in place measures to adapt to the climate change that is already occurring and which is already locked in, even if we do manage to reduce emissions. So huge issues to be discussed, and there's a huge amount of information been coming out. We're here in the middle of the second week of the negotiations. There's been lots of scientific information, lots of discussions on policy responses, civil society responses, lots of statements being made on new commitments to reducing emissions and funding for adaptation. So this discussion now will be to provide a snapshot of some of the key information of where we currently are in terms of emissions, where we're headed, what that means in terms of future global warming in relation to the ambition of the Paris Agreement to keep global warming well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and also to discuss the implications of this, what the risks are from climate change, both now and in the future. Now, we have a great panel of speakers to take us through all this information. We have three talks to start with from Professor Pierre Friedlingstein from the University of Exeter, Professor Piers Forster from the University of Leeds, Professor Ross Cornforth from the University of Reading. They will give some introductory presentations with the latest information. And then we'll be joined by some additional panel members who will give their own perspectives on the issue. So we have Adele Thomas from the University of Bahamas and Climate Analytics, Deborah Roberts, who's co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, and also works in the government of eThekwini municipality in South Africa, and Jason Lowe from the Met Office Hadley Centre and University of Leeds. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. There's an opportunity to ask questions online as well, so please do put your questions in the chat online, and we will do our best to answer those when they come through. But I'll now hand over to our first speaker, Professor Pierre Friedlingstein, to give us an update on where we are with the global carbon budget. Over to you, Pierre.
Thank you, Rich. I hope you can hear me. If you could show the slides. All right, thanks. So I will make like a brief presentation on where we are in terms of, CO2 emissions and the fate of CO2 emissions in the Earth system, which is like an activity from the Global Carbon Project. So this is the 16th time we do an annual estimate of the global carbon budgets. The data have been published in Earth Science Dynamics. It's under review actually now, open review. It's a massive effort from the community, as you see on the slide. 94 people were involved in this assessment this year from 17 organizations, 18 countries. All data are publicly available, including all the figures that I will be showing in a second. So if you could move to the next slide. So I'll make like a rapid overview of what we assess. We assess the emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere, primarily from fossil fuel combustions, but also from land use changes, mainly deforestation. We also assess the fate of the CO2, which we emit, which goes either in the atmosphere, stay in the atmosphere, leading to the increase in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, the main driver of climate change. But a fraction of the CO2 we emit goes back into the land ecosystems and the ocean ecosystems. About half of the emission goes back into these components, and I will say a few words briefly on this component as well. If you move to the next slide, this is the latest on the fossil fuel emissions. As you know, there was a massive decline in the CO2 emission in 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic around the world. We assessed the emission for 2021, so the first year after the pandemic and the recovery of the economy led to a massive rebound of the fossil fuel CO2 emissions in 2021. I mean, the level of emission in 2021 we expect is almost equal to where we were before the pandemic in 2019. And this is occurring across most sectors. I mean, the coal went up massively in 2021, as the gas. I mean, the only sector which is not as large in 2019 is the oil, because many transport hasn't fully recovered from the pandemic. If we look at, I mean, the national levels, again, I mean, we see like a rebound in many sectors. Sorry. The next slide is this one, which is the second component of the emission. It's a land use emissions. It's, well, almost a factor of 10 lower than the fossil fuel emission, but still it's significant. As you can see on the slide, there is large uncertainties to quantify the emissions of land use. It's driven by, it's a complex system. We have essentially a change in area of crops and pastures from FAO, which are converted into transition from forest to non-forest, and therefore, these transitions are converted with bookkeeping models into carbon fluxes to try to quantify how much carbon is going in and out, I mean, following land use transitions. There is a decline in the land use emissions, the net flux that you see on the left side, which is occurring now. It's mainly because of an update of forcing the land cover change from FAO, as I was saying. This is brand new stuff. We're not 100% sure that this is strong. And again, as I said, I mean, there is large uncertainty on these fluxes, as you see with the brown area. The net flux is the difference between the growth and the growth source, mainly the deforestation itself, but also like a growth sink of carbon from land use, which is the recovery from abandonment of agricultural lands, essentially. Next slide. If we look at the CO2 in the atmosphere, I mean, well, obviously CO2 concentrations are still going up, increasing, I mean, year in, year out, including during the pandemic in 2020, the CO2 still went up because the world was still emitting, well, about, I mean, 36 billion tons CO2 into the atmosphere. We are now reaching in 2021, 415 ppm, part per million, which is about 50% higher than at the pre-industrial time. Next slide. So this is showing all the whole budget that we put together. I mean, I briefly discussed, I mean, the emissions from fossil fuel and land use on the top and the CO2 increase in the atmosphere. But as I said before, a fraction of these emissions goes back into the land and the ocean. We estimate that, I mean, about 53% of the emissions are going back into the land and the ocean. The land carbon sinks and the ocean carbon sinks are still increasing in time, essentially in pace with the fossil fuel emissions. We don't see a strong decline in the land and the ocean sink. However, with the model we use to assess this, we can quantify the contribution of CO2 increase in the atmosphere to drive these things and climate change. And we see that the climate change is reducing the strength of the sink. So that's a positive feedback in a sense, by about 15% for the land carbon sink and by about 5% for the ocean carbon sink. If you move to the next slide, which is my final slide, we also quantified the remaining carbon budget, which was assessed by IPCC, and Piers will say more in a few seconds. So the IPCC was published in 2021, using a budget up to 2020. So we update with the emission during the pandemic and after the pandemic, and the remaining budget for 1.5 degrees is left, which is left to us is about 420 billion tons CO2. Which is equivalent to 11 years of emissions at the current rate. And for the 1.7 and 2 degrees, you have the numbers in front of you, 770 and 1,270 billion tons CO2, respectively, 20 years and 32 years from 2022. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Pierre. So that's a great overview of where we are at the moment. Clearly, a lot more needs to be done, but it's great that this project, the Global Carbon Project, does this annual monitoring of emissions. It's a really crucial scientific service to the policy community. So thank you for the update. So now I'm going to hand over to Piers Forster, who will answer the second part of the question about where we are headed. Over to you, Piers.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you here today. So yeah, I'm really going to talk about what are the options going on from where we are to kind of today. But first, I would quickly like to go back to look at the remaining carbon budget. So what I've got on the screen is kind of the kind of table from the IPCC report, and Pierre has updated it, so the budget had come down, but what I want to explain that we did look at all the terms in the budget quite carefully, and although there have been some updates and some changes, the overall picture is that the carbon budget we came up with in the special report on 1.5 degrees is really robust, and we have a good understanding of what the remaining carbon budget is. And I wanted to kind of highlight on this particular PowerPoint is the dependence on the carbon budget estimates of what does occur for your non-carbon dioxide kind of terms. So in fact, the budget is quite dependent on taking a very aggressive mitigation pathway for these other terms. And there has been a lot of talk at these COP negotiations about actions in the next decade. And I just wanted to highlight on this diagram the real significance of those actions for affecting near-term temperature trends. So this looks at the kind of scenario we looked at in the IPCC report, and you can see across the 5 different scenarios that there is the temperature trend over the next 2 decades to range from 0.1 degree per decade in the best case one. It's still an increase, but that is very different than 0.3 degrees per decade in the worst case scenario. There's been a lot of talk about methane cuts at this conference, and you can see that is the kind of third bar on this diagram, and you can see you can definitely make a big difference in that methane pollution, but you also see, in fact, what it's doing really is more compensating for the decrease in aerosol pollution, which adds to the surface temperature. But the good thing about taking those cuts, of course, is that you have a huge benefit for air quality at the same time. But the thing that isn't talked about really so much about the things you can do if you start to urgently mitigate carbon dioxide. In fact, there's a big difference in the temperature trends you do get, a factor of 2 difference in the trend, depending on what we choose to do with carbon dioxide over the next decade. This, of course, is quite significant, but just because if you do look at what countries are committing to in terms of their emission reductions, a lot of their commitments come after that 2030 time frame. So there really hasn't been that big shift in ambition up to the 2030 target. So people talk about after that. Unfortunately, the countries aren't exploiting this opportunity. And you can definitely see this. This analysis is about to come out on the Carbon Brief website, and you can really see it on this graph. If you do compare the commitment for 2030 to the other promises that come after that, it's also really interesting. The thing I want to point out, I think, is that it's not completely pessimistic, perhaps, because if you look at what has been achieved in the COP negotiations, there has been some good progress over the last 12 months perhaps to increase ambition, but it is still not anywhere close to getting us below 2 degrees. And I want to go on now at the end of my talk to talk about why the temperature targets are so significant. We of course have some irreversible changes like ice sheet melting and sea level rise and things, but the rate of sea level rise can be really affected by the temperature we end up with, of course, when we get to the net zero targets, and you can really see a big increase in extremes as we get to these targets, but the good thing is, if we are able to get to these net zero targets and eventually to stabilize the surface temperature, then a lot of these extremes will not continue to get worse. And the other thing I should touch on just before I pass on to Ross Cornforth to go into more detail is that, of course, not all countries are affected equally by the extremes, and it just so happens to be an unfortunate twist of nature that the countries that have done least to cause climate change are the ones that are most vulnerable. And if you're interested in this work and what we've done, I would encourage you to go to our website. And I'll pass back now to Rich.
Thanks, Piers. So it's clear that we're still not on track to meet the targets, even though progress has been made, and the climate change impacts are already happening, and risks are already increasing and will continue to increase. Of course, the risk from climate change comes partly from the hazard, the change in extreme weather, or the change in the background climate conditions, but also it depends importantly on the exposure and the vulnerability of people and ecosystems and so on. One way to deal with that, to some extent, can be adaptation. And Ros Cornforth works on operationalising the adaptation agenda, so she's going to be talking to us about that now. So over to you, Ros.
Thanks so much, Richard. And yes, absolutely. Everything, although of course mitigation is so very much important, is also crucial that we think about how do we actually operationalise the adaptation agenda in practice now at speed and really target actions appropriately. And I just want to remind everybody, take people back to the opening statements of Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who really situated the climate crisis in humanity. And that's what it is. The climate crisis is about people. In a discussion earlier this week with the Madagascar delegation, there were lots of questions around how do we really implement the declarations now at the community level? How do we ensure adaptation options are community-led and appropriate? And there's no two ways about it. There is a scale gap between the global climate projections and the local impacts, where economic, governance and social factors are interacting with the changing climate. So we need to bring together global and local information in a very consistent way, where we can really understand climate impacts in terms of people's support systems. So the Walker Institute, we're very much focused about generating knowledge for people, harnessing the primary science that we've just heard discussed to produce the tools and approaches that really assist decision-making on the ground, bridging local to national level. And this is really important. It is crucial we change course and start implementing a decision-centric framework when it comes to adaptation. That requires us all to step out and think about how we're communicating, how we're engaging at every level from the start of every part of our work, so that decision-making is climate informed but contextualized by the local circumstances and can support and are supported by new and very exciting approaches to a generation of interdisciplinary knowledge that draws from both the physical and the social sciences. To this end, in terms of operationalizing the adaptation agenda, it's not sufficient to think about one piece at a time. It's not sufficient just to think about the technology that's needed, the governance structures that are needed, or just to focus on the research. It all actually needs to come together you wouldn't do a jigsaw without putting the 4 corners in place. And that's what is needed now. If we're going to move towards a decision-centric framework, putting people at the center, then we've actually got to think of a systems-based approach where every element helps us to develop a better understanding of the context and the communication channels that can really inform climate resilience decision-making at that national and local levels. There are 4 elements to that. And this is the bit that really helps us to move beyond just pilot studies and another feasibility study to full implementation. So those 4 pieces are part of an integrated framework to operationalize adaptation. They do include the interdisciplinary research that we're all involved in, helping to really generate the rigorous science and lead on an evidence base that supports the investment strategies that are so crucial now in terms of adaptation, the adaptation agenda. But a second part of this is really working to join up the disciplines and sectors. We talk quite often about multi-stakeholder fora. We absolutely need this. We need multi-stakeholders. We need everybody around the table, a multi-sectoral response if we're going to deal with the multifactorial impacts of climate change. But these 2 don't stand alone. Alongside this, we have to bring it together new skills and build capacity that really enables people to interpret the multi-sectoral data, to synthesize information, and in a way that really helps to ensure that decision-making can go forwards based on the decisions people actually want to make. And the 4th pillar, yes, it is about data and technology, but it's very much demand-led, working to develop the analytics and the open source technology that addresses the decisions that people want to make. There is a plethora of data out there, but it's about understanding the use cases, which data streams are most appropriate to bring together to support that decision that people have on their desks. Decentralizing that, bringing people, the local experts, into the equation to help really improve the link between climate impacts and people's coping strategies is crucial. I will conclude there, but just to say that we really do need to move towards this integrated approach. And a really critical part of that is the collaboration and the partnerships, ensuring that we have a 2-way exchange of information about the risk that people face, my risk, your risk, our risk together. We need to be able to understand that and ensure that at the table, the people whose decisions and adaptation options we're talking about are there at the table and leading on that adaptation planning. So it's really about moving to a decision-centric process, which is beyond just co-production. I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ros. Yeah, so it's crucial to remember that this is about people, and it's about bringing the right people and all people into this discussion to make sure that the right things can happen. So now we have 3 additional panel members who are going to join us to give some of their reflections on what they've heard and about their take on what we're hearing from the wider COP26 meeting. And then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves with some questions about what we've learned from this and how we can move forward. So I'm going to invite each of the 3 additional members of the panel to briefly introduce themselves and give their initial thoughts. I'm going to start with Adele Thomas. Adele, please tell us about yourself and your initial thoughts on this.
Thanks, Richard. I'm Dr. Adele Thomas with Climate Analytics and University of the Bahamas. And so what I think we need to add to the conversation is this focus on climate justice. It's been something that's been talked about increasingly, and I think that the presentations highlight that needs to be a key part of the conversation. So which countries are emitting and have been emitting versus who is feeling the impacts and who is able to engage in the adaptation agenda that Ross just outlined for us. And so as a small islander, I'm going to focus on small islands. We contribute less than 1% of the emissions that are driving climate change, but we are already experiencing significant and unsustainable impacts at 1.2 degrees of warming. So we're seeing extreme events already being intensified. We have billions of dollars of damages from these extreme events. It's often several times our annual GDP. We're having to use our national resources to recover from these events because there's not finance available for loss and damage. And this takes money, resources, time away from sustainable development. It leads to increased levels of debt, and it erodes our adaptive capacity, which then makes us more vulnerable when the next extreme event comes around and makes us more vulnerable to long-term impacts of climate change. And so we're already seeing this unvirtual cycle where our adaptive capacity and our resilience is already being eroded. So current levels of global warming are already a challenge for us. At 1.5, it's going to be even worse. It's not some picnic in the park for us at 1.5. And above that, it's catastrophic. We're talking about threatening the even survivability of SIDS and the desirability of people to want to live in our island nations. So for us, 1.5 to stay alive is something that we've been saying for many years now. It's not just a slogan, it's a reality. And so it is incredibly alarming, to say the least, looking at our current trajectory of where we're heading. And I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Adele. And now I'd like to invite Deborah Roberts to introduce herself and give her initial thoughts. So over to you, Deborah.
Hello, Richard, and everyone attending the session. Also good to see some of my IPCC colleagues there. I'm Deborah Roberts, and I come to the session wearing two hats. The first, Richard has already indicated, I'm co-chair of Working Group 2 of the IPCC, so we have a deep interest in the impacts, adaptation and vulnerability elements that have been spoken about by Ros and Adele. But I also work very much at the grassroots level. I'm still a local government practitioner working in the city of Durban in South Africa, and it's really those two perspectives that I'll bring to my opening comments here today. For me, the most important message in relation to 1.5 is something Adele, I think, has already hinted at. I really worry when my policy-related colleagues hold up 1.5 as some kind of band-aid or silver bullet, with the assumption that 1.5 creates a safe world for us. 1.5 is a very dangerous world. And if we look to the special report on 1.5 degrees produced by the IPCC in 2018, it's very clear about that. It doesn't indicate 1.5 to be a safe world, but it does indicate that it's a far less dangerous world than one we would encounter at 2 or more degrees. And I think that's really important to realize. And certainly, if we look at our Working Group 1 colleagues and their main assessment report that was released in August of this year, they indicate that we're already sitting at 1.1 degrees. So that's already in the bag. And if we look at that, we can see that that's a very dangerous world. I'm particularly interested in one of the sectors that Ros referred to. Obviously, we need a systems approach, but I'm particularly interested in cities. And at 1.1, cities in Africa are already facing day zero because of drought. The urban areas in the small island developing states that Adele has just spoken to are affected by devastating sea level rise and powerful storms. Cities in Europe and North America are dealing with deadly heat waves, and our Australian colleagues sitting in urban areas have been threatened by wildfires, literally at a continental scale. We've not seen that before. And I'd really want to underscore the fact that while I think a systems approach is important, an urban viewpoint is really important when we consider our climate change responses, because that same special report on 1.5 degrees of global warming pointed out that if we're serious about this low carbon, climate resilient, equitable future that Adele is pointing to, that's going to require a transition in our urban and infrastructural systems, along with a number of other key global transitions. And that's a not insignificant challenge, because urban areas are where the bulk of us currently live. They are centers of money, power, and influence. And so the scale of the transition that's required in the urban system is truly global. But there's also a global scale opportunity that would co-benefit many of the poor and vulnerable that Adele has spoken to, as the bulk of our future urban growth is in fact going to be in places like Africa and Asia in the global south. But there's absolutely no question to respond to those challenges and reap those opportunities are going to require high levels of political will, substantial funding. And the question is, are we on track for that in Glasgow? My personal opinion, outside of the two hats I wear, is we don't ensure this urban transition and we shoot through 1.5. I can see a future where our cities become our largest stranded assets increasing poverty and inequity basically around the world. Thanks very much, Richard.
Thanks, Deborah. And now over to Jason Lowe. Perhaps you could introduce yourself and give your initial thoughts. Thanks, Jason.
Hi, Richard. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. So my name is Professor Jason Lowe. I divide my time between the Met Office, where I take a lead on climate services, and the University of Leeds, where I look at multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary climate research. I'm very interested in the perspective that I think we've seen at COP, that we're very much moving from the science defining the problem to the science contributing towards solutions. And I think we have to recognize that the science and the innovation together can help. But I think, as Ros said, you have to add the other magic ingredient there, people, as well. Some other reflections from my world. I very much see that we need to take mitigation, adaptation, and development together. But something that really hasn't been high on the agenda is that of co-benefits. And thinking about the co-benefits on aspects like air quality, like health more generally, like energy security and prosperity, to me are a key part of understanding why there are additional advantages even beyond avoiding impacts from following the low carbon 1.5 degree mitigation scenarios. I also wanted to focus a little bit more on thinking about adaptation and residual impacts. So clearly we're at around 1.2, 1.1, 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial now. The most optimistic scenarios for a median case are taking us to 1.5 degrees. And of course, if we look at the pledges so far, we've seen information out today. Piers showed some information. We saw Climate Action Tracker show that the median temperature could be well above that, 2.3 or 2.4 degrees. But that's the median range. There's a possibility of being even warmer. So the focus on adaptation needs to be higher, in my view. And we need to be preparing realistically for some of these greater warming levels while still aiming for the lowest levels. And to finish, I just wanted to put some numbers from a study I was involved in a couple of years ago on the amount of avoided impacts between 1.5 degrees and 4 degrees. We looked across a range of sectors, and we estimated you could avoid somewhere between about 62 and 95% of the impacts by limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Those numbers, in my view, are massive.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you for those thoughts. I agree with you what you say on that, on the implications of those massive numbers. So I have some specific questions to the panel. I'll ask some specific people, but if you want to jump in on any others, then feel free to, because many of them will be actually relevant to several people, I think. I'd first like to ask Deborah. So you're co-chair of the Working Group 2 report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and we're still working on that at the moment, working very hard, and that will come out early next year. But one of the important things for IPCC is to link across the disciplines and across the working groups, and Piers showed the results from the conclusions from the Working Group 1 report. So Deborah, I was wondering what struck you from the Working Group 1 report when it was published. What are the starkest things from that, and the most important things we need to address in Working Group 2?
Thanks, Richard. And yes, indeed, as you say, Working Group 2 is still hard at work. And I was going to ask you what you're doing sitting in Glasgow. So we'll have that conversation afterwards. I think the most important thing from the Working Group 1 report is the emphasis on the fact that the kind of changes we are going to experience in this century if we don't see this rapid decline in emissions are going to be unprecedented, and they're going to be unprecedented in thousands of years, in some cases millions of years. And that poses a real existential threat to both ourselves as a human society, but indeed the planetary systems we depend on, the natural systems that underpin our development. And quite frankly, our governments and governance systems are not really set up to deal with something that's that extraordinary. And so we face a time of extraordinary crisis, not only in the natural world, but also in the social and governance world, if these unprecedented changes materialize. As I indicated and Adele indicated, we're already beginning to see some of these emerge. We can see how governments are battling to deal with these extremes. And so it poses a very real challenge to the notion of sustainable development. Will we be able to achieve the sustainable development goals by 2020, or does that become a pipe dream because of these unprecedented changes? I think the Working Group 1 report also indicated that the rate of change would have to be rapid. The next 10 years are simply fundamental, and that poses real policy challenges for us. Are we moving fast enough? It would seem that all the indications are we're not moving rapidly enough in that direction. And what that means for Working Group 2 is a real reality check, because the kind of transformative changes that we've certainly anticipated might occur, as inferred in the special report 1.5, may not materialize. And so from a Working Group 2 report, we may be facing a situation where the adaptation agenda is elevated out of necessity, but that we have to think about how we handle a suboptimal future, that this transformed, equitable, safe, sustainable world may not materialize. And I think that's a very significant reality check that Working Group 1 brought us as Working Group 2. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Deborah. So I'll come to Ros first. Do you want to say something? And then Adele. Yeah.
I just want to bring it back down, actually, to the detail again, because, yes, it's absolutely critical that in terms of a multi-sectoral response, that governance structures need to be looked at and strengthened. But let me just one small story very quickly. We were looking at supporting the development of implementation, actually, of a climate resilient health system. And it's really small, it's understanding where the challenges are, where the gaps are in those institutional structures that perhaps are relatively small interventions but can make a huge change in terms of implementation of adaptation. And in terms of supporting this particular health service and sector, that very small piece of change, transformation that was required was actually in terms of the legislation and a simple agreement, MOU if you like, between two government agencies to ensure the right data flowed at the right time, so interventions supporting malaria, for example, could go ahead. And it's of course, we're all working at an international level, but we really need to make sure that we're also drilling down and making sure we're not missing small elements that can make profound differences in how we move forwards and accelerate the adaptation that we need to make.
Thanks, Ros. Adele, your thoughts?
Yeah, so my thoughts on the Working Group 1 report and how it informs Working Group 2, but also adaptation on the ground level, is that there's a disconnect between the level of warming that we're seeing and perhaps can expect and the type of adaptation that we need to put in place. So in small islands and coastal communities, there's really been this push for nature-based solutions, so do coral reef restoration, do mangrove restoration, and that's going to help you against sea level rise. But the rate of climate change and the impacts are showing that those nature-based solutions are not going to be feasible any longer. The special report on oceans, really highlighted that those coral reef restoration, mangrove restoration are not feasible above 1.5. And so I think what we're seeing is that adaptation also needs to be kicked up into high gear and to be transformative, along with the transformative changes that we need to see with mitigation.
Thank you. So I have another question. This time on the mitigation side, on emissions reductions and the way emissions are, how they are currently tracking. And this is probably to Pierre, actually. So Pierre, you mentioned that the oil emissions declined last year because of the reduction in transportation largely, but have not yet fully rebounded. And you pointed that out in your talk. Now today is Transport Day at the COP, so this seems quite relevant. So what are your thoughts on, can we expect the emissions from oil to fully rebound in the same way that coal emissions have, or can we, or will we do anything to make the most of this of what's happened in the recent years of the system change, or is it a longer term thing, or is it a bit of both? What are your thoughts on the rebound of oil?
Well, thanks, Richard. Yeah, well, obviously we don't know yet what's going to happen in 2022. We can only speculate based on what's happening so far, and the state of the system. So I mean, as you said, it might be a bit of both, depending on the countries in the region. In most places, I suspect, I mean, oil will continue to increase in 2022. Potentially being back to the level it was in 2019, like we see for coal and gas already, essentially because transport is not fully back on where it was in 2019, especially air transport. That's obvious. The transition from fuel-based transport to, well, electric and based on renewable, it's happening, but slowly. And of course, it is something we could expect. I mean, because it doesn't change overnight, so it does take time. It will take time, and yeah, we can't say for sure. But my personal prediction would be that the oil emission will continue to grow. I mean, to grow in 2022. I mean, for the full recovery before you see like a global decline in the oil consumptions.
Thanks, Pierre. So it sounds like if we do need to make the most of that, then other measures are needed beyond just electrification. So maybe more movement towards active travel and so on, I guess. So, but yeah, that's an important point to discuss. I'd like to turn to Piers now, if I may, on some more information on the implications of current emissions and current commitments. So we're hearing numbers like 1.8 and 2.4 degrees global warming in different contexts. So, the implications of pledges, but then current emissions. Could you explain a bit more about this and where we are heading with and what the implications are of these different things?
That is correct. So the whole principle of the negotiations is work on countries submitting nationally determined contributions, and the country to submit their effort just before the beginning of the COP negotiations. And if you took them at their word that they would really achieve those 2030 targets, then there's the potential that by 2100 we might see temperatures of 2.4 degrees or 2.3 degrees, but that would again be the kind of the estimate. So of course with that there's still the kind of physical science possibility you might get bigger temperatures if the Earth response is different than we think it is currently. But that would just on the 2030 submissions, and they're perhaps the ones that are more credible and more achievable. But the country at the same time doing that, they also submitted all these different net zero targets. And if you do combine the net zero target they all submitted with their 2030 ambitions, you can perhaps get surface temperatures coming out at the end of the century coming out about 1.8 to 1.9 degrees, but that is a huge kind of credibility gap, of course, with that. But because they really aren't making the concrete promises to have emission reductions in the next decade, and without that, their 2050 targets become less credible. And the other thing is, because if emissions stay flat, of course, we will exhaust the remaining carbon budget within this decade or just after, and that then puts a lot of pressure, of course, on possible solutions like carbon dioxide removal, which come with their own possible side effects for sustainability and for the kind of technological and kind of feasible challenge. It's even more complicated, in fact, than that, because of the kind of halfway through, the UK government tried to do all the extra things that were out of the traditional NDC pathway, things like pledges on methane, cash, cars, and coal, and there were the speech by UK government representatives kind of partway through the COP that did give the impression that these things could bring additional benefit, kind of beyond what's in the NDC pathways. I mean, there are really good things that I talked about, but they can't really be seen as additional to what's in the NDCs at all. But I think what they can see is they perhaps make the NDCs more credible, that those NDCs will eventually be delivered.
Thank you, Piers. So I have another question here, which I'm going to initially pose to Jason, but I think other members on the panel may have some thoughts as well. So given what we've seen in the talks here at COP26, what do you think are the scientific priorities for the climate science community to help inform the transition to a resilient net zero world? So Jason, over to you first of all.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I think the first thing that stands out is we need to make sure we maintain and probably extend the observation network. I mean, it's been the bedrock on which the evidence has been based. And it's clear there are gaps in the current network, and there are opportunities to improve from in situ and from satellite measurements, and applying machine learning to get more from those measurements. When we turn to the tools to predict and project the future, I think we can look along the different axes. So when we think of complexity, the opportunity is actually trying to further narrow down our understanding of the carbon budget and which pathways are viable. So there are processes missing from the current Earth system models, for instance, around fire or the complexity of representing permafrost. There's also a need to use those Earth system models to try to get a better handle on where we might trigger large-scale changes in the climate system, for instance, tipping points. And that's something at the moment we're still struggling to do. We also need information that helps us better understand how we plan adaptation. So we need to better characterize uncertainty, and that's going to require potentially larger ensembles of models and better designed use of the models. It's also going to require more use of the very high resolution local simulations, convective permitting models that, for instance, we've seen used over Africa and in the UK, that let us actually look at extremes and take them down to the scale where people actually live. We need to make sure we are joining the physical hazard models to appropriate estimates of vulnerability and exposure, and again, to make these more relevant. And I focused my answer there on the physical sciences. Actually, this is an interdisciplinary and a transdisciplinary problem. So we very much need progress in, for instance, understanding how people make decisions, understanding how to communicate better, and understanding how we combine some of the behavioral changes with the more engineering-based changes. I could probably go on all day, but that's probably top of my shopping list.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jason. So I'd like to invite Pierre to make some comments on that question.
Yeah, I want to make some quick comment, and also, going back to what Pierre was saying, to me, the science is clear. There is a limited amount of CO2 you can still emit in the atmosphere before reaching, 1.5, 1.7, 2 degrees or any climate targets. But specifically for 1.5, as we said, repeatedly said, the remaining budget is extremely low. It's about 10 years of emission globally. And if you look at the current pledges, and I think there is a bit of a risk of having a focus on the net zero target and whether it's like 2050 or 2060, depending on countries, but not so much focusing on how we get there. And I think the how we get there is critical. And when I'm looking at the current pledges, I'm seeing that the how we get there at the moment is like essentially no reduction in the coming decades, and maybe drastic reduction later on in the second part of between now and 2050. And if this is the case, well, I think the 1.5 if it's not that, it's on life support, as people have said before, because it's really critical that emission has to reduce sooner than that. So I think the focus has to be on the near term, and by near term I mean the next 10 years as well, and not so much on the medium term, which is the 2050 kind of target.
Thanks, Pierre. Deborah, do you have any responses on this question?
I do, and I'm really enjoying this conversation because it's such an important reality check. I think one of the biggest gaps from a research perspective was highlighted. The IPCC recently co-sponsored with UN Habitat and the Global Covenant of Mayors a large-scale global conference on climate change science and cities. And the resounding message from that was the huge implementation gap that exists, particularly in the adaptation space, between the plans and what is happening on the ground. And I really do think we need research. Obviously the research Jason has indicated in the physical environment is critically important, but we need research that enables adaptation on the ground and can facilitate that. And I think we need to move from an understanding of risk to solutions, which I believe this assessment cycle has done, but from solutions to implementation. It's one thing to identify what you can do, it's quite another to deliver on that. Another huge gap for me, and this brings in my urban interest, is that the urban system provides us with one of those opportunities to get real bang for our buck at the global scale. But the bulk of that urban development is going to occur in those places of the world that we've already indicated have been the least involved in causing the problem, but will experience the maximum impacts. And their informality, the informality of the development path is significant. And I don't think we have enough research which indicates an alternative vision for these kind of informal landscapes. We tend to want to put informality into a dark corner somewhere and not acknowledge it, and we really don't speak to that. And a third important message which came from this global conversation around climate change, science and cities was the need to reflect on the social development of our cities, our historical past and how we've handled it, to bring in culture and heritage and indigenous knowledge in new and important ways in our decision making. And I think these are all things that are currently getting quite a light touch from the research perspective and really could benefit from further support and more profiling. Thanks so much, Richard.
Thanks, Deborah. So I think everyone has some thoughts on this question. So I'll turn to Adele now. So what are your thoughts on how the scientific community can help with the transition to resilient net zero?
Yeah. You ask a bunch of scientists this questions and we could talk all day. So from my perspective, I think we need much more research on transformational adaptation. It's becoming increasingly clear that incremental adaptation that we're doing now is not going to be enough to deal with the level of impacts that we're facing. And this transformational adaptation research needs to look at more than migration. So from SIDS, you know, it's like you're experiencing these impacts, and so your only option is to migrate. We need to look at other options besides that. Related to that, I think we also need further research on assessing loss and damage. So these negative impacts of climate change that are already happening and that will continue to rise, and also on how do we address loss and damage. So how do we deal with the economic impacts as well as non-economic loss and damage, such as trauma of losing, you know, family in extreme events, mental health challenges. And then finally, I think we really need to take a closer look and pay attention to who is engaged in doing this needed research. I think we need much more research coming from scientists and from institutions in the global south. We are directly experiencing these impacts, and we need to be part of the solutions. Thanks.
Thanks, Adele. Ros, your thoughts?
Thank you. So I just, brilliant points made by everyone so far. Deborah, I love that point about implementation, which goes back to the comments I made at the beginning. You know, to move, we've got to move beyond these feasibility studies and get to full implementation, which requires us to pick up all four corners of the jigsaw puzzle: the tech, the data, the governance and structures, the research, and the capacity building. Unless we're doing all of those together at once, we will not get any further. So that was a brilliant point. But also back to Jason and what I said at the beginning, we have to be able to map climate impacts in terms of people's support structures. What are their coping strategies? How are they dealing with the recurrent crises that they face every day in their lives? And so that, yes, that does, of course, need us to improve and continue to invest on the ground information systems. And you rightly picked up weather information, of course. But we also need to invest in a decentralized system where we are able to systematically track the impacts of climate change on people's livelihoods. Quantitative measurements of livelihoods means that we can actually bring them together as physical scientists with quantitative information about climate, and putting in place a system that actually builds the evidence base so that we can actually track what is happening. That requires a large-scale investment. It also requires us to think about how we can use every technology, including machine learning and remote sensing, to be able to monitor impacts on people's livelihoods. Which takes us back to that point about, because unless we do this, we will not be situated in the space where people are, being able to better understand the risks they face, because actually at the moment, our assessments of risk are very far removed from reality. We need to really be able to sit in the space where people are and understand the context so much better. So I think in terms of future, it's also about new research that we're all involved in actually as well, in terms of looking, for example, at storylines and using that as an approach to understanding risk in the context that people are facing. So investment, capacity building, and also enabling the people who are facing the risk to be part of that adaptation planning and data collection process is also important.
Thanks, Ross. So we're getting a great multidisciplinary perspective on this question. So finally, to Piers for your thoughts on the priorities.
Well, I'm certainly not going to go over it again because I think people all gave brilliant answers, but I just pick on something that Adele brought up right at the end of what she was talking about, and this is, I really think it's time we really democratized our science and try to make it accessible and work for everyone, and to get everyone better in the kind of global South countries kind of really delivering the kind of world-leading science kind of from their own agendas and leading the agendas and leading the direction. And it's quite notable, for example, there's still not so much science on loss and damage compared to other areas. So I think if we effectively democratize our kind of science, and we have skills, we have techniques for that, like the use of these simple emulators for temperature change, but that can also be used for impacting things. And I think these are kind of powerful tools that can really help with that democratization. But I would just really like to see kind of panels like this almost reversed, with the stakeholder community coming from the global, I mean, not coming from the global south, coming from the global north perhaps, and kind of we're responding to some wonderful kind of science coming out of the global south. I do think it'd be great. So I would like to come back to one of these, but I would like to be on the other side.
Thanks, Piers. Turn to you, Ros, now with a specific question for your area. So on operationalising adaptation, a lot of what we know is at small scales and pilot studies. How do we go beyond that to actually achieve large-scale impact?
Well, I mean, actually, it ties up some of the previous points in terms of decentralising data collection, and I think that making that quantitative link between climate and livelihoods is so very important in terms of impact at scale and using, for example, the remote sensing technologies. But I think beyond that, what's so very important is the partnerships that we have, and which just goes back to Piers' point as well, and truly to really attain greater impact at scale, we have got to really work much more closely with the private sector. That has got to happen. It's been a large part of discussions of this particular COP around climate finance, of course, but that public-private sector engagement is really where we can enable so much more quickly. So I would, I'd be very interested in hearing other thoughts from other members of the panel on that. But that's something we haven't typically been so good at as a community of scientists. But now we really need to get on board and really put flesh on the bones of the public-private partnerships and what they really look like in practice. That's when we can get to impact scale and go beyond the pilot studies that we all get stuck in.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we haven't really addressed yet in this discussion is the issue of tipping points, which is a very sort of common concern, but that often is not as kind of central to the discussion as a lot of people think it should be. Piers, do you have any thoughts on the sort of the role of climate system tipping points and whether these affect the kind of conclusions that you were presenting?
Yes, I do. So we talked about tipping points quite a lot in the IPCC report and the kind of best way of presenting them. And the story which I do very much kind of buy into, the story I want to convey, is that, quite a lot of the climate change we're seeing today is irreversible, things like the thawing of the permafrost and things, and we of course could get the collapse of the Antarctic ice sheets, but we have a bit more firm information than before that a lot of these big abrupt changes might occur. They aren't going to occur instantly, and the really big thing we've discovered is that if we can get onto one of the low emission pathways, things aren't going to be, then the chances of them occurring really reduce. So the potential for very high 9 meters of sea level rise have been discussed and things. The chance of that occurring is if we do get on the 1.5 degree pathways, they really diminish hugely. So the story I've got for the COP negotiations is, I mean, I sort of think they don't have to factor into them because we have to get onto the low emission pathways. We have to try and get as close as we can to 1.5 degrees, and the climate change is affecting us today, as we do hear from Adele, and kind of Deborah and Frost. too. So we have to really worry about the next 2 or 3 decades. And I think this existential idea of things occurring in 2100, 2200, yeah, perhaps they are going to occur, but we can avoid the worst of them if we really do get on these net zero pathways.
Thanks, Piers. Adele, do you have any thoughts on the tipping points question?
Yeah, I think the tipping point is very important, particularly from coastal communities, because we think about tipping points and we think about sea level rise, right? So you'd have these catastrophic levels of global warming that would then lead to, multi-meters of sea level rise, and we won't be able to adapt to that. And this links tipping points to limits to adaptation, which has been an area of increasing research. And the latest research on limits to adaptation is telling us that we face these limits to adaptation long before these tipping points in the natural system. We're currently seeing limits to adaptation, based on socioeconomic factors. We don't have enough finance to adapt. We lack the governance to adapt. And so we're already seeing loss and damage because of limits to adaptation, but from the socioeconomic perspective. So while these tipping points are very important, and they may lead to, absolute hard limits to adaptation, we're already facing softer limits to adaptation now, simply because we don't have the finance and the governance capacities to be able to deal with current levels of climate change.
Thanks, Adele. Pierre, just briefly, do you have any thoughts on this from the perspective of monitoring the climate system and the carbon budget from about tipping points, and perhaps including the issue of methane as well as carbon?
No, okay, here we go. Sorry, I was muted by you guys. I couldn't mute myself. So, well, yeah. If you look at the global carbon cycle, and the CO2 increase in the atmosphere over the last 60 years, and the way we interpret the change in CO2, we don't detect any tipping point in the carbon cycle yet. As I said in my brief presentation, the rate of uptake of carbon by land and ocean altogether is still increasing, and is still taking about the same fraction of emissions, 53%. It has been taking this fraction over the last 60 years. As long as we've been measuring CO2 precisely from Mauna Loa. So we don't see a global carbon cycle tipping point occurring yet in the observation. That doesn't mean there is no reduction in the sinks because of climate change. As I mentioned briefly, yes, there is a reduction. We don't detect it because of the large natural viability of the carbon system. But according to our models, which are the same models as the one we have in, Earth system models being used in IPCC, there is a reduction of the sinks in the carbon sinks due to climate change, both on land and ocean. This will amplify in the future. I'm not 100% sure I would call this tipping point. These are just large-scale climate perturbation on the carbon cycle that are amplifying with, the magnitude of the climate change.
Thanks, Pierre. So we're running close to the end of our time now. So this is possibly the final question. We'll get as many responses as we can. It's a general question to the panel, which again is quite a common one, which is what can we recommend to people about what they can do to help and play a key role in addressing this critical question. I want to turn to Adele on that first of all. Any thoughts on what people can do?
Yeah, sure. I think people, sometimes want to know personal things that they can do, so like giving up meat or something like that. But I think what we need is much broader scaled action, and I think it's important for people to continue to place political pressure so that we have the political will to act. I was glad that Ross brought up Mia Mottley's speech, president of Barbados, and in her speech she said, how much longer are we going to talk about climate change? So we've gotten the political pressure. We've seen the Leaders Summit here. Leaders are talking about climate change and what we do, but that is not translating into the level of action that we need to see. And so I think continued political pressure to now change talk into the action that is needed to deal with climate change is needed. Thanks.
Thanks, Adele. Anybody else on the panel want to come in on that? Anybody online want to? Jason, do you have any thoughts on this? We haven't heard from you for a while.
Yeah. So I think people play many roles in society. So there are some things that people can do as an individual, and we can all look at those lifestyle choices around travel, diet, how we insulate our homes. But we're also part of other structures. We're part of organizations, and we have to understand the larger role, I think, for businesses in this. We heard one of the other speakers say that earlier. We also need to think how we influence on a regional, national, and international scale, and part of that is through the democratic process. And I think you can't separate these. You can't just do one and ignore the other. You have got to have a clear message of how individuals can have an influence on each of those scales. And it comes back to communication and having clear messages about what we know, what we think we know, and being honest about what we don't yet know. And finally, bringing in, I know I mentioned it earlier, the co-benefits of acting as well, because this idea of reducing the psychological distance so people understand and think about what is happening around them, but also what's happening close in time. We need to really understand those levers that make the climate issue relevant.
Thanks, Jason. And Deborah, do you have any thoughts on what people can do?
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for that. Probably the most important question of this panel session. Having been a negotiator for many years in a previous life, I recall how insular things like the COP can be, because one goes into a bubble that's often detached from the real world. And gratefully, my local government roots keep me at the grassroots. And while we can speak on a panel like this about climate change in a way that assumes that everyone knows about it, that's not the reality on the ground. I can tell you many of the people I work with in my local government career are not aware of climate change. If they were aware of it, it would probably be number 100 on their list of top 10 things to worry about. And so I think the ability to get information to people is still incredibly important. We did outreach on behalf of the IPCC in Africa using regional messaging for the first time early this year. And again, even talking into our academic community. A lot of this information, just because of the imbalances that Adele has hinted at in the academic community, means that a lot of our academics have not been fully exposed to this information. So there's still a very real need to get information out, which I think is important, certainly about the science, but then what you can do to change your daily life, what you can do in terms of political pressure. But again, making information available doesn't necessarily empower action. You know, a lot of the people I engage with, for example, in our formal settlements, simply don't have the resources to change anything about their lives. And so we've got to think about supporting that kind of action. We can't expect people, particularly the poor and vulnerable, to guarantee their own resilience without support. And this comes back to a change in governance. How do we draw these people to the table? How do we support them? Raises financial issues. So this is a very complex question, which, as Adele suggests, goes well beyond a decision to go vegetarian or not. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Deborah. So we're out of time, sadly, but it's been a great discussion and hopefully useful for everyone watching as well. So thank you to all the panellists. I just want to sort of summarise by saying it's clear that problems are becoming ever more urgent, both in terms of emissions cuts and dealing with adaptation and resilience. We're increasing the understanding of this issue from the science. It's multidisciplinary. We need to learn more, and we need to keep working together ever more closely between scientists and policymakers and civil society to develop and apply our knowledge to address this critical issue, limit global warming to as lower levels as we possibly can, and remain resilient to the changes that are no longer avoidable. So thank you everyone for watching. Goodbye.